In the early years of the 19th century, Ireland was a land of breathtaking contrasts. It was an island of stunning natural beauty, a place poets called the Emerald Isle. Its rolling green hills stretched for miles, meeting the dramatic cliffs that guarded its shores against the wild Atlantic. Ancient stone walls, covered in moss and history, crisscrossed the landscape, dividing small fields of impossibly green grass. The air was often soft with mist, and the light had a magical quality, casting long shadows over valleys and glens. Rivers shimmered like jewels, and lakes reflected the vast, ever-changing sky. This was the Ireland of song and story, a place that seemed almost enchanted, untouched by the harsher realities of the modern world. Yet, beneath this picturesque surface, a tragedy was unfolding. The beauty of the land masked a deep and persistent poverty. For the vast majority of its people, life was a daily struggle for survival. The land itself was the source of all wealth, but most of it wasn't owned by those who worked it. It belonged to a small class of landlords, many of whom lived far away in England and had never set foot on their own estates. They viewed their Irish lands simply as a source of income, renting out small plots to tenant farmers who lived under the constant threat of eviction. It was a system that created immense insecurity and left millions vulnerable. This system of land tenure shaped every aspect of Irish society. The population had grown rapidly, reaching over 8 million people by the 1840s. With land being the only means of support, it was divided and subdivided into smaller and smaller parcels. Many families lived on plots of land no bigger than a garden, barely enough to sustain them. Their homes were often simple, one-room cabins, made of mud or stone, with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Life was precarious, dependent on the success of a single crop and the mercy of a distant landlord. There was little opportunity for advancement, and no safety net to catch them if they fell. Despite these hardships, the Irish people were known for their resilience, their strong faith, and their vibrant culture. Family and community were the bedrock of their existence. Neighbors helped one another, sharing what little they had. Even in poverty, there was music, dance, and storytelling. The Irish language was still spoken widely, carrying with it the ancient myths and legends of the Gaelic world. Life was lived close to the rhythms of the seasons. There was joy in a good harvest, in the birth of a child, and in the gatherings of community. But this fragile world, so full of beauty and hardship, was balanced on a knife's edge, unknowingly waiting for a catastrophe that would change it forever. For the millions of poor tenant farmers across Ireland, life depended on a single humble crop: the potato. It had been introduced to Ireland centuries earlier, but by the 1800s it had become the cornerstone of the rural diet. The potato was a remarkable plant, perfectly suited to the Irish soil and climate. It was easy to grow and incredibly nutritious. Most importantly, it could produce more food per acre than any other crop. A single acre planted with potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. For a people with very little land, this was nothing short of a miracle. It was the crop that sustained them, the pillar that held up their world. The reliance on the potato was almost total. For a third of the Irish population, it was their only solid food. An adult man might eat up to 14 pounds of potatoes a day. It provided the calories and nutrients needed for hard physical labor. Children grew up on a diet of potatoes and buttermilk. The potato's success or failure decided whether a family would eat or starve. It was both a blessing and a terrible vulnerability few appreciated. In the years leading up to the mid-1840s, there were subtle signs that something was wrong. Strange rumors and reports began to trickle in from other parts of the world. In North America, in 1843, a mysterious new potato disease had appeared, wiping out entire crops. It spread with alarming speed, leaving devastation in its wake. By 1844, the disease was being reported in parts of continental Europe. Farmers in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands watched in horror as their potato plants withered and died, their tubers rotting into a slimy, foul-smelling mush. These were whispers on the wind, distant stories of misfortune that seemed to have little to do with Ireland, and many ignored these early warnings. The British government, which ruled Ireland directly from London, operated on a philosophy of laissez-faire, a belief that the government shouldn't interfere in the economy. The intricate and fragile nature of the Irish rural economy was poorly understood by those in power. The summer of 1845 in Ireland was unusually cool and wet. The weather was damp and muggy, creating perfect conditions for a fungus to thrive, though no one knew it at the time. The potato crop looked promising at first. They had no way of knowing that a silent, invisible enemy had already arrived on their shores. The blight, a microscopic fungus named Phytophthora infestans, was likely carried across the Atlantic on ships, its spores traveling on the wind and in the damp air. Late summer of 1845, the first reports began to surface. A farmer in County Fermanagh might notice a strange brown spot on the leaves of his potato plants. Early autumn of 1845, the reports continued to surface. A woman in County Cork might dig up the first potatoes of the season, only to find them riddled with a strange, dark rot. At first, these were isolated incidents, dismissed as a curiosity or a local problem. But soon, the reports became more frequent, more urgent. The blight was spreading with terrifying speed. Within a matter of days, a field that had looked perfectly healthy could be transformed into a blackened, decaying wasteland. The whispers had become a roar. The storm had arrived. On the eve of the famine, Irish society was a complex tapestry, tradition, faith, community, woven together against a backdrop of deep-seated poverty. Life for the majority revolved around the land and the seasons. The year was marked by agricultural tasks, plowing in the spring, tending the crops in the summer, harvesting in the autumn. It was also marked by religious festivals and ancient Gaelic celebrations that connected the people to their history and to the cycles of nature. Despite their material poverty, the people possessed a rich cultural and spiritual life that gave their existence meaning and structure. It was a world that was about to be shattered. The autumn of 1845 brought a new and terrifying smell to the Irish countryside. It was a strange, sickeningly sweet odor of decay that clung to the damp air. It drifted from the potato fields, a foul announcement that something was terribly wrong. Farmers who had watched their potato plants grow strong and green now stood in disbelief before a scene of utter devastation. The leaves on the plants had turned black, curling up as if scorched by fire. The stalks, once sturdy, were now limp and wilted, collapsing into rotting heaps. With growing dread, families went out to their small plots to dig for their food. Digging up potatoes, once hopeful, had become an act of desperation. They plunged their spades, known as sleans, into the dark earth, praying to find something edible. What they unearthed was not the firm, wholesome food they depended on. The potatoes they pulled from the ground were a horrifying sight. Some were shrunken and hard, others were soft, dissolving into a slimy, foul-smelling pulp in their hands. The blight had not just killed the plant, it had destroyed the very food beneath the soil. People tried everything they could think of to save the crop. But nothing worked. The blight was unstoppable. Potatoes that seemed fine when first dug would rot within days, turning winter stores into a stinking mass. The loss was immediate and catastrophic. In weeks, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the nation's potato crop was lost. For millions who relied on the potato for every meal, this was not just an agricultural crisis, it was a death sentence. As the autumn of 1845 bled into winter, the blight tightened its grip on the island. The disease didn't strike everywhere at once or with equal force. It seemed to creep across the country like a malevolent fog, its path dictated by wind and weather. The pathogen is believed to have originated in the Andes Mountains of South America, but the first and most severe outbreaks in Ireland were concentrated in the east of Ireland, in counties like Wexford and Waterford. From there, Eberstadt-in-Mats, in Dax-in-Dots, and Stocktons, Itundea, Idapun, spread relentlessly westward and southward. The further west one traveled, into the poorer counties of Connaught and Munster, the more complete the devastation became. A farmer with a seemingly healthy crop would see his entire crop blackened overnight. The speed of the destruction was shocking. It created an atmosphere of intense anxiety and helplessness. People watched the skies, fearing the rain and mist that they now knew fed the disease. The roadsides were littered with discarded potatoes, thrown out by families in a futile attempt to stop the rot from spreading to the few good ones they had managed to salvage. The smell seeped into people's homes, a constant grim reminder of the hunger that was to come. By the end of 1845, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. The food that was supposed to feed millions of people through the winter simply didn't exist. The coming winter would be a time of unprecedented hardship. The Kingdom of Green had become a kingdom of rot, and its people were now facing the terrifying prospect of starvation. News of the unfolding disaster was slow to reach the corridors of power in London. When the first reports of the potato blight arrived, they were met with disbelief. And with downplay, British officials, many who'd never set foot in the impoverished west of Ireland, struggled to comprehend how dependent people were on the potato. The free market, it was believed, would solve the problem. Sir Robert Peel was Prime Minister at the time. Peel took the initial reports more seriously than many. He secretly authorized the purchase of £100,000 worth of maize, Indian corn, from America. The idea: create a food reserve to sell cheaply to the Irish poor and keep prices down. But the amount was only a fraction of what was needed. A gesture, not a solution. The imported Indian corn posed a major challenge. It was unfamiliar, and people didn't know how to cook it. The corn was hard and needed grinding, but there weren't enough mills in the west of Ireland. Eaten unground, it caused severe digestive problems, stomach cramps, and dysentery. The yellow corn was grimly nicknamed Peel's brimstone. It was a poor substitute for the humble potato. The government provided assistance, but it wasn't free. A complex system of public works was instituted, one meant to discourage reliance on public welfare. Destitute men, women, and children did manual labor in exchange for room and board. Men built roads and dug canals. They broke stones and chopped wood, anything to keep them busy. Men, already weakened by hunger, did the most grueling labor to earn pennies, often in winter. Women were assigned to laundry, kitchen, cleaning, or sewing. The elderly were often segregated and given lighter tasks, if able. Children were sent to school during the day, and sometimes apprenticed or did light work after. Many people died in the workhouses from disease or starvation. Orphaned and deserted children were raised within the workhouses, which became increasingly more and more overcrowded, unsanitary, and unreliable. The policy was a catastrophe, tangled in red tape and flawed ideology, tragically inadequate. The year 1846 brought a false and cruel glimmer of hope. The potato crop planted that spring seemed to be thriving. Many believed the blight was a one-time catastrophe, but in the late summer the disease returned with an unimaginable fury. This time, nearly the entire potato crop across all of Ireland was wiped out. The nation was left staring into the abyss. The winter that followed would become infamous in Irish memory. It is known simply and starkly as Black 47. The year hope died and survival became the only prayer. The weather was exceptionally brutal. Heavy snows fell, blanketing the landscape in white. Remote villages were cut off for weeks at a time. The relentless cold tormented people, paralyzed by hunger. Public works projects, the government's main relief, became scenes of immense suffering. Starving men in rags were forced to labor in freezing temperatures. Many collapsed and died from exhaustion and exposure on the roads they built. By spring 1847, the countryside was littered with the dead and the dying. Visitors and relief workers recorded almost unbelievable horror. People wandered roads like ghosts, bodies wasted to skeletons. Faces were etched with a vacant despair. Children were found crying by the roadside, parents having perished. Entire families were discovered dead inside cabins, quietly starved to death. Normal rituals of death and burial were abandoned. There were too many dead to mourn or bury with dignity. Bodies were placed in mass graves, often without coffins or ceremony. The government's laissez-faire ideology had failed. Public works were abandoned in summer 1847. Soup kitchens emerged, funded largely by private charities like the Quakers. The British government belatedly contributed. The soup was thin, watery gruel, barely nutritious. For many, it was the only thing standing between them and death. Huge lines of desperate people formed for miles, waiting for a small cup of soup. Hunger was the architect of the famine, but its deadliest agent was disease. The most prevalent of these famine fevers were typhus and relapsing fever. Both were spread by the crowded and unsanitary conditions that the famine created. For a population already on the brink of death from starvation, contracting one of these fevers was almost always a death sentence. Dysentery was another constant and deadly companion of the starving. Caused by bacteria, it spread through contaminated food and water. The doctors and clergy who tried to help were completely overwhelmed and often became victims themselves. They moved through a landscape of death, with no effective treatments for the diseases they faced. As hunger and disease consumed the land, a new and desperate hope began to take hold: escape. The famine turned this trickle into a torrent, a massive panicked exodus. It wasn't a journey of ambition, but a flight for life itself. The decision to leave was agonizing. It tore people apart. Parents, siblings, the graves of ancestors. It meant leaving the small plot of land that, however poor, was the only home their family had ever known. The main escape routes were the ports of Ireland, Dublin, Cork, Limerick. But the busiest port of all was Liverpool. This mass movement was one of the largest in human history up to that time. Between 1845 and 1855, it's estimated that over 2 million people fled Ireland, nearly a quarter of its entire population. The vessels that carried the desperate Irish across the Atlantic were not built for passengers. The conditions on board were horrific. They quickly earned a grim and fitting nickname, the coffin ships. The emigrants were packed into the dark, airless holds, far below the main deck. There was no proper sanitation, no ventilation, no provision for cooking. The journey itself was a brutal ordeal. It could last anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months depending on the weather. Storms were a constant terror. The crowded, unsanitary conditions were a perfect breeding ground for disease. The same fevers that had ravaged Ireland. Typhus, relapsing fever, stowed away on the ships. The diseases swept through the packed holds with terrifying speed. The mortality rate was staggering. On some voyages, as many as 1 in 3 passengers perished. The dead were unceremoniously wrapped in a sheet, weighed down with a stone, and dropped over the side into the cold Atlantic. For those who survived the crossing, the ordeal wasn't over yet. The ships would often arrive at quarantine stations, such as Gros Isle in Canada, which were quickly overwhelmed. Many who had survived the Atlantic crossing died here, within sight of their destination. Even those healthy enough to pass quarantine found the first moments on land disorienting. They stepped into a world that was utterly alien. They were penniless, friendless, and traumatized. They possessed nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce will to survive. Standing on the shores of a new world, they represented not just an ending, but a new, uncertain and defiant beginning for the Irish people. The vast majority of the Famine Irish didn't have the money or the resources to move inland and buy land for farming. They congregated in the very cities where their ships had docked. They poured into the port cities of the American Northeast, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. They crowded into the poorest, most dilapidated neighborhoods near the waterfront. Life in the tenements was grim. Entire families, often 10 or more people, would be crammed into a single, small, dark room. There was no running water, no proper sanitation, no ventilation. To survive, everyone who was able had to work. Men dug canals, laid railroad tracks, cleaned city streets, and worked as dock laborers. These were jobs with long hours, low pay, and a high risk of injury or death. The phrase "no Irish need apply" became a common sight on signs for better-paying jobs. Irish women found work as domestic servants in the homes of the wealthy. They took jobs in textile mills and factories. As they gained a foothold, the Irish began to move into other sectors of society. They found a natural home in public service, joining the police forces and the fire departments. The image of the Irish-American cop on the beat became an iconic part of urban American culture. Within a generation, the children of the famine immigrants began to make their mark in politics. And in time, John F. Kennedy, a direct descendant of famine-era immigrants, would be elected President of the United States. The Great Famine wasn't just an event the Irish survived, it was an experience that became permanently embedded in their collective identity, both in Ireland and abroad. The local Catholic parish church became the center of community life, providing spiritual solace, social services, education, and identity. The memory of the famine fueled a deep and abiding resentment towards Great Britain. The belief that the British government's policies had turned a crop failure into a Holocaust became an article of faith. This bred a fervent nationalism. The music they brought with them, the sad ballads and airs of lament, spoke of loss, exile, and longing for a lost home. But there was also defiant joy in their music and dance, a refusal to be crushed by sorrow. In recent years, the science of genetics has added a new and fascinating layer to our understanding of the famine exodus. Modern genetic testing can connect people living today not just to Ireland, but often to specific provinces, counties, and local regions. This technology is creating a detailed personal map of the diaspora, confirming and sometimes challenging the stories passed down through families. The Great Famine didn't end on a specific date. By 1849, and into the early 1850s, the potato crop began to show signs of a more sustained, if partial, recovery. A key factor in the famine's gradual decline was the simple, brutal fact of a massively reduced population. The combination of mass death and mass emigration had drastically eased the pressure on the land. Between 1840 and 1850, about 780,000 Irish emigrated to America, and another 920,000 arrived in the 1850s. Meanwhile, a new poor law intensified the wave of evictions as landlords cleared their land of penniless tenants to reduce their tax liability. So while the worst of the starvation began to recede, the social upheaval of evictions and clearances continued with brutal efficiency. By 1852, most historians marked the famine as effectively over, but the silence that had fallen over the countryside was permanent. The famine ended not with a celebration, but with a quiet, exhausted sigh of survival from a nation that was irrevocably broken. Could the famine have been prevented, or its worst effects averted? With the benefit of hindsight, the answer is a resounding and tragic yes. 1. Immediate action: halt food exports from Ireland. But the British government, committed to free trade and market non-interference, refused. Merchants' and landowners' profits were prioritized over the Irish people's right to life. A more humane and effective relief system could have been implemented. Public works projects were a catastrophic failure. Meaningful land reform could have created a resilient rural society, less dependent on one crop. Such reforms were seen as radical and resisted fiercely by landlords. It was a missed opportunity of historic proportions. The Great Famine isn't just a chapter in Irish history, it is a profound and enduring lesson for all of humanity. Ultimately, the Great Hunger is a story about the consequences of dehumanization. It's a call for empathy, a recognition of our shared humanity that transcends nationality, religion, and class. It is a moral reckoning that demands we remember the dead by dedicating ourselves to preventing such a tragedy from ever happening again, anywhere in the world. Was anyone in your family part of this story? I hope you'll share their story in the comments. Thanks for watching and taking a few minutes to remember the tragedy of the Irish famine. Don't forget to give a thumbs up before you go.